If you travel around the world or spend any time studying the planet, you notice pretty quickly that biodiversity is different in different parts of the world. You're not going to find the same species richness in number and diversity in the polar regions as you are around the equator. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that. Concept 54.4 says biogeographic factors affect community diversity. Latitude and area are two key factors that affect a community species diversity. So we're going to talk about where on the planet we are as far as latitude, toward the poles or toward the equator, and also the amount of space or land that we're discussing as well. Both of those play a part in the diversity of a community. First, the latitudinal gradients. Species richness is especially great in the tropics and the areas around the equator, and generally begins to decline as you move toward the poles. Two key factors in this equatorial polar gradients of species richness are probably evolutionary history and climate. While you've had a lot of stops and starts over the millions, billions of years that Earth has had life on the planet in both the temperate and the polar communities, you've had a lot more disturbances in the polar regions. So think about, for example, ice ages where glaciers have come down and then receded and things of that nature. The greater age of tropical environments around the equator that have gone through perhaps fewer major disturbances, that means there is the possibility for greater species richness because they haven't been disturbed in major ways as many times as the polar regions have. Also in the tropics, the growing season is longer because you have this extended period of sunlight that lasts pretty much all year long, so the biological time runs faster. You have the ability to have a greater number of species, a greater amount of diversity, a greater number of generations of these species, because you have this constant energy input of the sun that you don't have in the polar regions. So if we look at this diversity, we can kind of pretty easily see that climate plays a major factor, is probably the primary cause of this gradient diversity between polar regions and the equatorial regions. Two main climatic factors correlated with this are solar energy and water availability. Again, solar energy is the primary source of energy for all living creatures on the planet, and you have a tremendous amount of that in the equatorial region. And then of course water availability is important as well. They can be considered together by measuring something we call evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is the evaporation of water from the soil plus the transpiration of water from the plants. So it's kind of a combination of both the solar energy and the water availability all wrapped up into one figure. You can see in these charts, when it comes to plants, the greater amount of actual evapotranspiration correlates with the greater number of species richness. So you're going to have a greater amount of actual evapotranspiration where you have more solar energy and more available water, and that's going to also correlate to a greater number of species. So at the top of the chart here, you would be thinking about like a tropical rainforest. At the bottom parts of the chart, you would be getting closer to either a desert region or a polar region. Down here with vertebrates, with animals, you see some of the same effect. So you see the potential evapotranspiration. You tend to have this grouping along this line of species richness and diversity, where for the most part, as potential evapotranspiration increases, also the potential species richness increases as well. The other factor that plays a part in species diversity and richness is the amount of area, the amount of land that we're dealing with. The species area curve quantifies that idea, and it shows if all other factors are equal, then a larger geographic area will tend to have more species. So if everything else is equal as far as climate conditions and energy availability, well then really it only comes down to space, amount of area. And the more space you have, the more area you have, the more types of species and greater species diversity you're likely to have. The book uses a great little chart that shows a species area curve of North American breeding birds to support this idea. So what you see is amongst all the different kinds of species of birds on a logarithmic scale here, and here is the space, the amount of hectares of area here again on a log scale. The more area, more space that a particular community has, the greater the diversity. You're going to have the maximum amount of diversity where you have the maximum amount of space in that community. In the past, in other chapters in this semester and last semester, we talked about the uniqueness of certain ecosystems like islands. Islands tend to be sort of individually unique and separate from the mainland, and we can see this on islands. We have what we call an island equilibrium model, and it says that species richness on islands depends on island size, which we've already talked about, area, but it also depends on distance from the mainland and immigration and extinction. So what are the species coming in? What are the species going extinct? What is the size of the island? And how far is it from the mainland? These are all factors that play a role in island equilibrium, where islands are somewhat different and unique from standard areas that we might look at. When we look at the equilibrium model of island biogeography, we get an equilibrium point of species richness, and I'll show you kind of a chart that shows that. So here we have extinction, and here we have immigration, and the number of species on the island moving to the right, growing greater as we move to the right. And here's kind of like this balance point right here in the middle. This is the equilibrium number, where the amount of immigration coming in and the amount of extinction that is taking species out, you kind of reach this middle cross point, and that's the number of species you would expect. Now if we compare that like a larger island and a smaller island, we would see that island size does have an effect. On a smaller island, that number of species is shifted smaller to the left. On a larger island, that number of species is shifted more to the right. Here we see an additional chart that shows the effect of distance from the mainland. Islands that are far from the mainland, they are shifted slightly to the left, a slightly lower number of species, and islands that are nearer the mainland shifted to the right with a larger number of species. A good real-world example that your textbook mentions is a study of species richness on the Galapagos Islands, and it supports this hypothesis or prediction that the species richness should increase with island size. So if we look at the various islands that make up the Galapagos and we kind of chart the species richness, the number of plant species, say for example, versus the area of the island in hectares, we notice that the greater the size of the island, for the most part, the greater the number of species. So that kind of goes back to our idea that space is a limiting factor in the diversity as well. So we see that species diversity can be limited by geography. It's limited by latitude. Are you near the equator? Are you near the poles? There's a couple of different reasons for that. We also see that it can be limited by the amount of space that we're talking about. A very small area is going to have fewer species, less species diversity than a larger area. We'll take another break. We'll come back for concept 54.5. 54.5 talks about a different kind of disturbance, not a natural disaster, not a weather disturbance, not even a human disturbance, but pathogens, and how pathogens and disease can alter communities, and we'll talk about that in the next concept.